Hello and welcome to the Queer Disrupt podcast. This podcast episode features me, Hannah Ayres, Cass Bradbeer and Mia Liyanage. We take you through what we feel a queer perspective is, our experiences of lockdown and offering and receiving queer care, and how we think these experiences can be archived. We finish with some rather excellent tales from queer history, so please make sure you stay tuned for that. We really hope you enjoy. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Queer Disrupt podcast. I am Hannah Ayres, and I'm going to be hosting this episode. We're going to be talking about queer care, we're going to be talking about lockdown, we're going to be talking about friendship, and a little bit of archiving, history type things. It's going to be very, very exciting. This episode today is going to be quite relaxed, very conversational. We have like kind of a loose structure, so we may go off track. But it'll be really good. It'll be really interesting. It'll be very chilled out. If you've never heard my voice before, do not know who I am Hannah Ayres. I work on queer representation in museums. I'm currently a PhD student in sociology at the University of Warwick. I also co-founded and currently co-convene Queer Disrupt. I'm going to pass over to Mia and let Mia introduce themselves.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm so excited to be here. I think this is going to be a very fun conversation. So my name is Mia Liyanage. My pronouns are she, her. I am a queer history enthusiast, scholar, etc. I did my master's in US history, but slanted it to be queer focused entirely at the University of Oxford last year. And my thesis was on queerphobia at Harvard in 1920, which I'm sure we might end up discussing today, which would be very fun. I'm also a decolonization advocate, and I currently work in anti-racism as my day job. Cass.
Hi, I'm Cass Bradbeer. My pronouns are they, them. I'm so excited to be here and to talk about queer communing. I'm a big fan of innovative ways of queer getting together and queer activism, especially creative ways. I study history of art. I love art, queerness, and protest, and I have enjoyed throughout my youth getting involved in queer activist movements, and I look forward to continuing to do that as I get into my adulthood now.
Oh, thank you. And I realized as everybody introduced themselves, I did not say my pronouns. My pronouns are she, her. So what we're going to start with today, and I'm going to ask a rather big question. What do you think it means to have a queer perspective on something?
So a lot of the work I've done has discussed and really included this idea of a queer perspective. And I've been really keen on talking about it as much as possible, because especially at the institution I was at, there's often a huge burden of proof on queer historians to prove that there is a queer perspective, because it's something that's quite intangible if you're not queer yourself, even though it's something that if you are queer, you know is a thing. You know that there's, to an extent at least, a shared understanding and a shared way of looking at the world. The way it's kind of come up for me in my work, so this is a specific slant I'll speak to, is I've thought and talked and written a lot about queer community, kinship, chosen family, and a particular way of looking at ties to other people in the world, which I think is very queer, and I will die on that hill. And that is that because of the different oppressions that queer people have faced, but also because there hasn't been the kind of straight and narrow path, pun not intended, but glad it happened, toward heterosexual marriage, essentially, queer people have always been looking for other ways to situate themselves within a space, gather people around them who accept them, etc. And I think the queer approach to friendship is really, really powerful, interesting, and not recognized enough in history. What I tend to find is that the queer perspective, in a lot of kind of quite surface level attempts to maybe queer a history that wasn't queered, right? Maybe by people who aren't queer themselves, is to essentially look for evidence of sexual contact and then basically say, well, that means that we can say they were maybe queer. But if that's not there, then the conversation is never even had. I'm very interested in looking at the distinct queer perspectives on friendship that we might be able to locate in the archive, and I'm sure we'll talk about the archive more later, and a level of kind of loyalty and familial style approach to friendship, coupled with a feeling of maybe not really belonging in wider society. If we can locate that in the archive, is also an indication of queerness. So that's quite a narrow comment on queer perspective, but that's how I've kind of interacted with it in my work.
I really like the idea of the queer perspective being an opener to empathy. I think that queerness is such a fluid and a diverse mode of identification, which is, I think, quite unique in that when we think about intersectionality in certain identities, I think queerness is particularly prone to thinking fluidly and thinking indeterminately. And when we conceive of one identity and one shared set of experiences as sort of indeterminate fluid exploded in itself, then we can, I think, find an easier stepping stone to perspectives of intersectionality. And I think one way that's really sort of opened that up for me is looking at different queer lenses throughout history. I found when researching my college coursework, when I was looking at Michelangelo and his lover Tommaso di Cavalieri, that my understandings of what sexuality was so opened up by this idea that there was a pre-modern form of sexuality, if we are to think of it in those terms, which is still debated. But I was really interested in this idea of queerness being seen in a different time as just acts, and sexuality as just acts rather than the modern forms of identities. And through shifting my particular queer perspective to a different queer perspective, I learned a skill of queer empathy, I think, that opened my eyes to the potentials of the queer perspective.
Yeah, I agree with you both. In my own work, one of the reasons that I even started the project I did was because I see, and I think a lot of people see, but like if you study history, you really get this, but if you don't study history, maybe you don't come into contact with it as much, but history is just absolutely like integral for people's lives. And so what I wanted to investigate was, if you can't see yourself in history, how do you force that understanding? How do you force that representation? How do you say, I was here and I am here now, and there is a lineage and there is me, and yeah, there's this queerness beyond sexuality and gender, right? Because sexuality and gender differs in time and space and cultures and all these different things. But I love the idea of queer is anything that rubs up against the norm. It's disruptive, even mainstream queerness, right? Like it makes me laugh because on TikTok at the minute, there's currently this little bit of discourse around Target, because I think it's Target, they've came out with this like Pride collection, and it's so garish and just a little bit off the mark. I say a little bit, it's quite a lot off the mark. But even in that mainstreaming of that queerness, right, people are going, what is this? Oh my God, there's just so much happening, right? So even in that mainstreaming, there's still this disruption, there's still this, oh, you don't quite belong in this space, or it's not correct for you to be here. Yeah, a queer perspective for me is this ability to force your way into a room, I guess, to look at things in a way that some people take for granted, I guess. Does that make sense?
Oh, entirely. And I mean, I just wanted to say that firstly, I am obsessed with Cass saying that queerness is an opener to empathy. I think that is fantastic, and I'm going to start saying it, and I will credit you in my conversations. And also to say, like, yeah, Hannah, agreed about what the historicization or the kind of archival presence of a group does. Like, we know this is important for people from marginalized communities, like we know that. But yeah, with queerness, it is super important because that historicization is validation, and it's proof that we all exist and have done. And also, I think, you know, what we're talking about is a very intangible thing, which I love. I mean, I deal in and with intangible things, so that's fine. It's really hard to nail down, you know, the queer perspective and say this is exactly what it is, which of course is sort of the whole point, and the beauty of it is that it's transient and it's fluid. But given that it is, it obviously is really hard to locate. So wherever we can find things that give us that feeling. Like when I discovered the sources I used for my thesis, I read them and got the feeling that these people were all queer. And I can absolutely point out individual things where I'm like, this is the queerest thing I've ever read. But altogether, it has this feeling washes over you, comes over you about what this history is trying to tell you. And the fact that, oh, I can see the joke that this person's making, or, you know, it feels very similar to the way my friends and I talk now, like that sort of thing. And for me, that queer perspective and then queer relationships, etc., of any kind, platonic and romantic, they echo each other in the archive when you do find something in a really nice way, because I found reading stuff from 1920 that to me, this seemed incredibly modern, what I was reading. But I think that it seemed that way because queer discourse still harks back to terms and lexicon used in that time. So it's sort of like this little queer time warp, which I really love. And, you know, call this a superiority complex, but I believe that we as queer people hold the key to that. And I'm not sure that straight historians doing queer history can locate it in the same way.
I totally agree. And picking up on these notions of identifying different queer histories in the past, and also emphasizing the queer perspective and queerness as a kind of pushing up against norms, I really have enjoyed the insight on a whole range of history that I've got as a result of putting together a timeline of queer protest over the last 2,500 years. And it's also because a lot of that timeline was illustrated for my history of art course with 0 to 100 CE China, suddenly thinking about the cut sleeve love. And I mean, I could talk about lots of different things from many different centuries. And we see these queer stories and these queer acts of rebellion as well come up again and again and again. One of my dreams for maybe over summer, I might put this together, is to do a kind of similar timeline, but to have something from every century for the last 2,500 years, and to really try and get this sense of repetition, but not quite repetition, because everything's fluid and different, more rhymes, more poetry and rhythm and queer rhythm, different modes of queerness that help us develop empathy when you look over all these different kinds of queerness. I just think that would be really wonderful.
All of this is like reminded me, I had to like look online because it reminded me of a quote from Jeffrey Weeks, and I'm gonna read the quote here. What makes queer history popular, I think, is not so much the idea of a continuous past of which we are part, but the acknowledgement that we are different and yet can still find startling moments of identity that highlight our common human aspirations across the chasm of time. But I think that's really kind of what we're talking to here, right? These moments of identity and these moments of, oh my God, it's me, or it's not me, or it's something interesting. But yeah, I wanted to just backtrack a little and jump off this kind of queer perspective, Cass, that you were talking about as an opener to empathy, because I think that's a really interesting way for us to move on to talking about, okay, we have this queer perspective and we're very empathetic, and then we've been thrown into a pandemic and lockdown and this space of disruption. So I wanted us to start to think about our own experiences, other experiences. So how do you think this queer perspective then translated into lockdown? Let's start with Cass. I'm going to throw you on the spot.
Okay. So I really got a sense that over, at least in my experience of lockdown, that these friendships that I developed before became more stretched in their modes of empathy because I wasn't allowed to be with these people in person. I think it was harder to give a hug, to offer my home for them if they needed to get space from their family. It was harder for me to do these things, but at the same time, I actually found my modes of defiance with my friends be enhanced. And there was something very particular about the way that I engaged with Zoom calls or like just FaceTime calls or whatever with like a small group of my friends. We're all queer, half of us are trans, and we were all talking about, we all went to the same old school, and we've been talking about our experiences of just really difficult and different experiences of things like transphobia, like my friend being called Trouser Girl in year 7 and having stones thrown at her in the school grounds, and me being given a detention when I was 13 for being in the girls' bathroom and having detention in front of all my peers, and me being threatened with suspension when I was 14 for wearing earrings because that was not according to the boys' uniform. Those stories came up again, and we were able to, even though we had different experiences, empathize with this mutual, whether it's queerness, whether it was transphobia that we'd experienced, we were able to empathize. And from that, beautifully, we actually catalyzed moments of defiance. And I'd just like to talk briefly about an experience that I had with the chair of the Board of Governors at my old school. In February, a member of staff reached out to me asking whether I could be part of a series of videos from alumni for current students talking about our experiences of how wonderfully open and queer my school was, because it was outwardly presenting as progressive. And I decided that I'd really like to talk about both my experiences of my incredible form tutors who really supported me and tried to resist the different regulations that were transphobic and put on me. But I also want to talk about those transphobic regulations, and I was not going to sweep that under the carpet. After responding to that, I got an email from the chair of governors asking me to engage with a conversation with her about some serious allegations that she'd seen I'd made. And during that call, she completely changed her mindset over what the queer and trans experience was at my old school and about what she could do about it. I had never, after pushing and pushing, got an apology for the transphobic detention that I received when I was 13. But I got that from her after that experience. And not only did I finally get that, but I also got a confirmation that the jury rules had now been changed so that no one would be threatened with suspension again if they were having an earring in just because they currently identified as a boy. I also found out that as a result of those meetings that the chair of governors was ensuring that LGBTQI plus topics are central to a new review of the curriculum by the academic team. The chair of governors has also ensured that the head and his senior leadership team bring to the governors a review of how LGBTQI plus issues are addressed at my old school so that they can review it. I'm so proud that my queer modes of convening and empathizing with my friends had helped me to open up about these stories, to feel that I could raise this point with this member of staff who reached out to me and has then catalyzed this change.
Thank you for sharing that, because that was really, really beautiful.
Thank you for telling us that, and thank you for imparting something so powerful to this space. It brings me a great deal of joy, queer euphoria, you might say, which is like the buzzword of my thesis. Anyway, can she say a sentence about mentioning her thesis? We'll find out. But it really gives me a buzz to know that something where you come up against authority did pay off in some way, and the fact that you felt empowered to do that because of the queer community and the queer friendships and the queer empathy that you'd built is really some model queer defiance, I'm gonna say. So yeah, I'm very proud too. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was just gonna ask, and this might be a really random question, but I'm gonna throw it in there. Maybe it's not the same for everybody, but I found that lockdown really made me slow down, right? And actually just stop and take some thinking, because I also, not in the same way, it wasn't quite as defiant, right? I guess it's defiant against myself. But I started going to like therapy and started really unpacking some like key trauma that I had never addressed, because I just go and go and go and go and never take time to stop. So I was wondering if you slowed down during lockdown.
Oh gosh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I really experienced that. My lockdown, I've lost track of how many lockdowns there've been. The 2020 thing until like September, I was locked down in Oxford, and because I was living in college accommodation, it was essentially on my own, although we did live in a kind of larger complex, so I did see people. And I'm someone like, you know, when you do personality tests and it tells you what percent extroverted you are. I think mine is 88. So I thought that this was going to be a total nightmare because I very much have, I suppose, for want of a better term, identified as or seen myself as a kind of classic extrovert. And because of that, lockdown was incredibly good for me in some ways, awful for me in others, of course, but it really forced me to have introspection on a large scale. And what I would often do is not kind of necessarily the big stuff, because I've been going to therapy for quite a few years and stuff like that, but kind of the little stuff that would happen. If you do feel a bit meh, then you just go and talk to your friend instead. Whereas I didn't have that option. And it really gave me also the space to start being a bit more mindful and taking more time deliberately for myself. Listeners won't be able to see this, but I have a embroidery in progress next to me. And I started doing that with queer history podcasts on. Yeah, Hannah has now shown us her embroidery as well. This is excellent. So it really gave me that space to be with my thoughts. And I thought that being with my thoughts would be terrifying because they'd all be bad. But actually, after a while, the bad thoughts run out. I mean, no, they don't run out, but they don't take over everything. And actually, at least if you have a bad thought, you've got the time to sit with it, unpack the bad thought and do something about it. So it was very freeing for me. And I feel like it's a bit odd because obviously in some ways it feels like we've lost a year or over a year now and things have been paused. But in terms of my own personal growth, I feel like I've gained 5 years because I spent so much time needing to do that for myself. And a lot of the thoughts I was having and memories I was remembering and, all of that and ideas I was having even from my academic work, a lot of those were focused on queerness. So it felt like a very queer thing to me. Maybe everything I do, I just say is queer because it's me.
So I really agree that a lot has been gained, I think, over this last year, especially in terms of the quality of my time that I've been able to spend with myself, but also I think the quality of the time I've been able to spend with some of my friends, my real close friends, when we are having these conversations, because they're not in passing in the university, accommodation or whatever. They are a really deep, prolonged, and often very private conversations. And I feel like I've explored a lot more with my friends than perhaps I would have felt able to otherwise. I think especially I've explored different and various and perhaps creative modes of things to do with my friends, because rather than just going out to the pub and getting a drink or whatever, going to the park, I've been getting on FaceTime with my group of friends and making jewelry or painting portraits or painting our nails, or maybe it's decorating our Minecraft server with queer and trans flags and trans inclusive menstruation posters. And we've really, I think, enriched these modes of engagement that we have done. But I mean, that is still very important to acknowledge how much, I guess, quantity I've lost, even though I think the quality of these engagements has been actually quite enriched.
It feels like the time I've been spending with others, at least, and it sounds like it's a little bit the same for you both, is much more deliberate, right? I deliberately want to spend time with you. I'm deliberately reaching out to you. And I had a really hard time with this because I am really busy all the time. So it used to be that I would run into somebody in a hallway and I'd be like, oh, do you want to grab coffee? And then we would go and get coffee, right? And I stopped having that. I started to get oh, if I reach out to this person, would they still want to spend that time with me, right? Because then it's deliberate. When we were talking before about this spending quality time with yourself and spending this time to unpack these smaller things, that was one of the things I had to unpack, right? I always felt like I didn't rely on these conversations with people, and I didn't rely on this running into somebody. I'm the opposite of you, Mia. When you were saying about you're very extroverted, I come across as very extroverted, but it's so exhausting. Like, I'm very actually quite introverted. I always thought I just didn't need that. I was like, this lockdown is going to be no issue. It's going to be no problem. And then I was like, no, I actually want to speak to somebody and I want to talk to people. And I actually spoke to Nick partway through the lockdown because Nick was somebody who I was seeing like loads. Nick is the other co-convener. I spoke to Nick at partway through and I was like, why is everybody speaking to you but not to me? And Nick was like, well, because you don't reach out to people, Hannah. You don't speak to people. And I was like, oh, that does make a lot of sense. Yeah, you are right. Yeah. So I started to reach out to more people. Everybody in Quidditch, some of them are quite close to where I am. And so I met up with James and Adebayo for a walk one day. Me and Adebayo had crossed paths, but we'd never met. All our talking had been through Zoom. And so we all went to the park and went for a walk and a coffee. That walk and a coffee, my legs were tired, by the way, but we spent 6 hours just walking. And it's not a particularly big park, right? It was just around in a circle because we were just talking. When else would I have the time to spend 6 hours walking around in a circle? And they were such rich and really interesting conversations. But I feel like now things are lifting a little bit. We're maybe gonna lose some of that time, this quality time. And yeah, how do you replicate that? So when we're talking about quality and quantity, time spent with each other and time spent with other queer people specifically, one of the things we wanted to discuss today was about these boundaries of queer communities in lockdown. I just wondered if anybody had anything to say about that.
I mean, just picking up on something I mentioned briefly earlier about boundaries with families, and I think the significant thing that I've seen that I've lost, or that especially my friends, the people around me have lost, is the ability to really escape. It depends on the person. Some of my friends are in flats, but some of my friends are living with their parents, and my friends who are in flats feel like they're in great safe spaces, that they can be talking to me over the call and feel like they're free with whatever they say. But my friends who were living with their parents, some of them really don't feel that's the case at all. And some of those friends were the same ones who would often come over to my family's house to stay with us for a bit if things were being difficult at home. And it's been really emotional and really difficult to have that taken away. And I think it's changed the way that I see my boundaries with my queer friends, because I think that there was such a sense of complete and utter openness, and you can come and do whatever and just come over and drop by, and that's just not there anymore. And so I feel like there's a big barrier set up with these people. And then there's of course the second barrier with my friends who are at their parents and don't feel like they're able to talk about things safely. I feel like there is still a barrier when I talk to them online, and that kind of barrier and boundary over what we can and can't say in those talks is challenging and different.
Yeah, I mean, that's so difficult. And I think so many people have been experiencing those assaults on their little queer communities, basically. What you said about how you had some friends in flats who felt really free, and that kind of contrast, that spoke to my own experience a bit. But I had a pretty good lockdown environment and experience as they go. And I was very lucky because I was a master's student and I was a bit older and I had a year contract. It was actually great for me because I was forced to stay where I was. What I did find though, just kind of echoing a little bit what Hannah was talking about, is that I'm someone who tends to be the one to reach out because I am friends with a lot of people who are more introverted, and I know that they do want to talk, but it's not always a conversation that they're going to start. So I try to do that quite a lot. I mean, not that that doesn't hold anxiety, because it does, but I tried to do it anyway. It was quite interesting in lockdown because obviously there was a bit of a turning point, a potential turning point for some friendships. So for me, my best friend lives in the US and has done, forever, except we're at uni together in the UK, but in the holidays he would go back. So I was very used to maintaining a close relationship online, on Zoom and stuff, before lockdown. So I felt like I had some tools there, and I wanted to make sure that I could share those with other friends, because especially some people I knew might be a little bit kind of hesitant to start just interacting quote unquote normally on Zoom, because it's not normal at all. But I decided to try as far as I could to like give various friends the opportunity to like transition a bit into that way of communicating. And with different people and different relationships, it worked out differently in a way that was like best for that interaction. But there are especially some friendships I can think of where like we're now much closer than we were because we made the decision to like convert that friendship into like a, you know, evening spent together on Zoom once a fortnight. And like when it is just you and one person or you and two people, there's a single conversation going on and there's nothing else to do because it's lockdown and you're in your own house. So you're not thinking, well, I need to leave at a certain time to get the tube or the bus or a cab or whatever. It really opened up the potential for me. And a lot of these people I'm thinking of are also queer people. It really opened up the potential to like build even stronger relationships. And actually, my final thing I'm thinking of is having just said that I was a real extrovert but loved the periods of introversion, like it proved to me that you know, supposed 12% introversion, I mean, obviously these things are all a load of rubbish, but like, bear with me. That supposed 12% of introversion was really important to me, and that it could grow and change in different circumstances. And also that it basically confirmed to me that if I've got a choice between like meeting up with one or two friends and having really quality conversations with them and meeting up with a group of 10 people, I will always choose the former. And I did sort of know that before, but I suppose in a way, lockdowns allowed me to force my other friends to do that kind of interaction with me because there was no choice. So I hope I've converted them, because I see some of that continuing, and maybe that's blind optimism, but I hope we don't lose it all.
So when you were talking, Cass, about the boundaries with families, I was one of these people. It looks very fancy behind me. For anybody that can't see behind me, there's like walls and walls of books that you can sort of see. This is not my house currently. I'm currently staying in the house of one of the history academics at Warwick because she very kindly let me live in her house. Yeah, it goes back to this spending that time with yourself and going, actually, what is good for me and what is good for my mental health and what is good for what I need right now. Having that time away as well has been really nice. You know, when you're around family, you have a pressure to perform at certain like times, even just times of the day, right? Like I had to be up at a certain time and I had to not be in bed, but like if I'm up at 3-4 in the morning, my dad's just like, why are you awake? And I'm like, also, but why are you awake? Like, you know what I mean? But like I didn't have to do that, right? When it was really hard. And so when I came into this house, I found that some hours of the day I would just go and lie down. And I would just lay down and just like relax and take a minute. It used to be when I got a little bit like that, I would just go to bed and just stay there. But I found that eventually, like Mia said, like the kind of bad thoughts run out and then I came back out. Like, but I would have never had that time, I think, had I been with my family. And so this time has been really useful for like understanding my own patterns and what do I need and how do I look after myself. And I was going to say that a lot of my experience with Zoom have been with Queer Disrupt. You know, there's been other things, but Queer Disrupt has been really interesting in terms of we now have like a global audience that I don't think would have ever happened had it just been like an in-person thing. But just seeing people, we did the Shout Festival and Danae Tokay Reed did a dancing workshop, and just seeing everybody dancing on screens. I was like doing technical support, so I was like, no, I'm not dancing. But seeing everybody dancing and like really enjoying themselves, and again there's like queer euphoria even through the screens. And at the end of that day we had somebody from Queer House Party do a little queer house party for us, and I always thought when I saw Queer House Party I was always like, there's no way. There's no way that works, right? And then I saw it happen. Saw people like starting to like flirt with each other and like even through the screen. And it was just so interesting to just watch that happen and the way that people still could connect in these spaces. It's been so lovely, actually. I really, really enjoyed it. And I would also agree. I can't remember who said it because I have a bad short-term memory. Like reaching out to friends who are not like close to you, like are in other countries or in other
other spaces, you know, like I got really obsessed with Bell Hooks. I think it's all about love. Like that book is just like, honestly, if anybody's not read it, I would tell you to read that now because it's incredible. But a friend of mine who lives in a different country was like, I'd really love to read that, but like it's hard for me to get hold of. So I just sent it to them. And I don't think I would have ever done that before, right? These things like this, these connections. I have friends that I talk to like on a daily basis, but we're not close in that way. But I think the lockdown helped us get closer. Last thing I was going to say was I actually met my boyfriend in lockdown, right? I met him in November. And the way that we met was through Bumble. But Bumble lets you record voice notes. And I was literally about to give up, right? I was not reading all about love for no reason. Like I was about to give up. And I was looking through all the people and I was like, like, he looks nice. He looks like he'll take a voice note. And so I recorded voice notes to him. And then we were recording this back and forth. And then our first conversation, so our first online date was like 6 hours. Just again, like me, you would say, like, you're forced to do nothing else, right? I always joke that if we had gone to a restaurant, it had been more awkward. And there was times where we just couldn't see each other in lockdown. We started to like play games online and do all this stuff and like have these other ways of doing things.
That I got very excited when you started talking about bell hooks, and both of you may have noticed that I looked very rude and stopped paying attention because I grabbed a whole sheaf of papers and like kind of brought them across the screen, but it's because it's a printout of my thesis and I literally have a bell hooks quote as the beginning quote of the third chapter. I mean, it's actually slightly more to do with what we were talking about near the beginning of our conversation, but it's the classic quote about queer disruption. Like, you'll both know this quote, but let's read it anyway because it's bell hooks. Queer, not as in being about who you're having sex with, that can be a dimension of it, but queer as being about the self that is at odds with everything around it, that has to invent and create and find a space to speak and to thrive and to live, which I love. I think it's such an important quote. The reason it's in that chapter is because this is the chapter where I lay out and explore the queer euphoria and the queer community that I located in a story that was it was a story about queer persecution by a university. So you would think that it would be a tragedy, but I believe strongly the story itself is not a tragedy in the classic sense. Like, it's got all these moments of joy in it as well as persecution. But I think also, like, that quote speaks to what we've just been talking about kind of boundaries of queer community and what we can find online. And there's something about creating spaces for ourselves. I mean, it's hilarious to think of Zoom as like a tool for queerness because it's just a platform. And of course, it's also so ubiquitous now. So my current job is a Teams organization, but my previous job was a Zoom organization. So Zoom totally has a work association for me. You know, it doesn't only have a queer euphoric association, if only, that would be nice. But I feel like with a lot of these pockets of friendships, relationships we've been talking about forming, like what Bell Hooks is talking about, inventing and creating and finding a space to speak and thrive and live. I mean, that's what we've been doing with the supposedly limited tools at our disposal, and everything that you've described, especially what both of you have described about the kind of really inventive ways that you've used this and other platforms. If that isn't queerness, I don't know what is. So I think queerness finds a way. I'm sure Cass's timeline would illustrate that far better than I could. But it finds a way, and it has found a way, even through Zoom, which seems like an unlikely candidate for queerness.
So we took a small tea break. I want to talk a little bit about our image and the image we project to other people and the image we have of ourselves and little different things like this. Because one of the things that I noticed, at least, maybe not with myself, but we ran a project called Queering the Quarantine, which has not been released yet. That is my fault. But it will be released at the beginning of July. But some of the submissions in that were very much like, oh, I could be myself in lockdown, or I could dress however I wanted, I could experience my agenda however I wanted, because there was no pressure from this kind of outside world. Some people will not have experienced this. You know, they may have gone from a place of great freedom to a place of very limited freedom in terms of how they express themselves. But I just wanted to talk about maybe the way that you two have experienced this, or not experienced this. Mia, you were talking a little bit in the break about your Zoom background and how queer that is. So I'll let you go first.
Yeah, sure. I've definitely thought quite a lot about how this small rectangle is what basically kind of defines me in this like new reality, or the reality we have been having anyway. There are advantages and disadvantages to that, but I've quite enjoyed it in the sense that I can, and by the way, I say this with a huge amount of privilege because I, at the moment, live in like a shared house, but one where there's quite a lot of space around. So I have a room behind me that isn't a bedroom, but it is only mine and only I use it. So I've got space to play with. And previously I was living in just one room at a university, but it was mine. So again, I was able to customize it. But that left me with decisions to make, but in a really interesting way, because actually the way I'm thinking about it is, as you kind of walk around the world and interact with people in person, the only thing you're bringing with you is yourself. And especially as queer people, the self we might be bringing to a space is one that gives us less safety than other people, or one where we're going to be erased maybe, or, you know, there are so many obviously different ways in which queerness is kind of received, I suppose, and different expressions of it and different identities within that umbrella. What I quite like about my little rectangle, although it's a little bit messy, but let's not look at that, I can actually bring only part of myself, so I don't have to worry that much about like my entire outfit or whatever, but also I'm able to bring with me like some things, because behind me there are things. So I could signal to people that, you know, I have got a bunch of like queer books behind me, or, you know, there are certain opportunities that this rectangle kind of has given me. But yes, I mean, a lot of my friends and I, and it'll be interesting to hear whether this has been the case for you two as well or not. A lot of my friends and I have been talking about what happens when you do have to be on Zoom or Teams or whatever in a professional setting, and what that means for what's behind you in so many different situations. Like, obviously this is a queer podcast, but if we wanted to talk about class here, you know, we could have a whole different discussion about class. Obviously these identities and these circumstances all intersect. What my friends and I have been talking about kind of with regard to queerness is things like, you know, what if I've got a little pride flag behind me on my bookshelf, which I did in my previous room, like, am I supposed to remove that or not? Like, what, you know, and genuinely, you know, what's the protocol? And in the end, I just kept them because I was like, why should I have to move them, basically? And I've had quite an interesting kind of journey, or like periods of transition since the pandemic started, because during that time I did half of a master's, finished a master's, did loads of job interviews, started a job, left a job, got another job, and I'm now doing that. So I've had loads and loads of kind of moments where I've needed to think quite carefully about, I'm literally having a job interview or whatever, or a big meeting, and this is the scene that they're going to see. So what does that portray? And like, obviously on Teams you can blur your background, but I've not actually done that because I suppose I've put so much thought into the fact that what's behind me will be behind me that I'm like, oh, I'm just going to accept it at this point. But that was a bit of a ramble, but I've definitely found the kind of me thinking more about curating the way people perceive me, which I suppose is something that as queer people we don't often have a choice about. So it gives us a bit more agency. And then also, just to say, because I'm sure we're all thinking it, like, Zoom has also changed the way we perceive ourselves massively, because we can see ourselves constantly. And I know you can hide self-view, but I've never actually done that, because the idea that other people can see me and I would have the opportunity to see myself, but I'm not seeing myself, seems in a way even worse, even though that's what we do in person. I haven't figured that out in my mind yet. But I mean, in a way, it's kind of taken away some of the fear, because actually, if you are washing yourself, you're like, oh, well, that wasn't that bad. How bad could it be? Anyway, those are my musings.
I really resonate with how you were talking, Mira, about this Zoom format and how that changes the way that we're seen and the way that we can curate ourselves. I think to touch on actually something that I felt has perhaps been a little bit easier for me actually in terms of how I curate my actual physical self, my outfit and stuff has been a little bit easier because of the Zoom format, is that I remember going into my first year at uni and being so worried that because I don't have a sign that says as they, them in pronouns in front of me, that people would misgender me. But the fact I put they, them next to my name in my Zoom name, you know, it really changed the game for me, because I felt like I could go into my lectures or my seminars and just throw on whatever I wanted, and I could roll out of bed. And it was really, really freeing, because I remember in my first year stressing about what dress I was going to wear, because I wanted to appear more feminine, because I have a lot of insecurities personally about feeling like I am often read as more masculine. And so I think a lot of that kind of tension has been taken away from my, I guess, morning getting dressed experience, which has been kind of beautiful. And now I just grab what's comfy and makes me happy. And I often wear this earring that I've got on right now that has like a feather and a peace sign, and it just makes me happy, you know. And I put on this shirt that I'm wearing right now because it's really comfy and large, and I often didn't wear it last year because it's got a hole around the waist, but it doesn't matter because I only see from the shoulders up. It's really made things a little bit easier for myself in that regard. And I think actually something I'd like to touch on as well is that it's allowed me to be more myself with my gender fluidity, because as a gender fluid person, I feel like I switch quite a lot compared to some of the gender fluid people I know. And I move around the gender spectrum, and I do find myself feeling like I want to pick out more masculine clothes at certain times. And I remember last year feeling like that when I was going in person, and I just didn't feel like I could because I was so worried about being read as male. And now I just feel like I can feel this weirdness of getting up in the morning and feeling like I'm 75%, you know, masculine and 25% feminine, and wonder what that looks for what I'm going to wear today without all the social pressures of am I going to seem non-binary. It's really been quite liberating.
That's super lovely, yeah. It's nice that, I don't know, in a way, Zoom can be quite constraining, but it's nice that we found like these ways of allowing it to give us freedom and allowing it to give us these spaces. Cass, because you were talking about like outfits and the way that you present yourself and stuff like this, and I don't know if this will fit in or if this makes sense, but I, like many people, I've never been like a small person. But I have gained weight during lockdown, but it never really mattered because you can't see me from the waist down, which meant I could just wear joggers. Do you know, one of the things that used to be quite, I guess, like triggering for me was when you put on your clothes and they no longer fit. That used to like really get to me because I used to like really obsess about my weight quite a lot. And then if you're wearing joggers all the time, you never have to go into that. And now I'm just like, you know what? I see myself so much that it's not actually that bad. Like, it's not that bad. It's not that deep. And I was in a Zoom class once, and one of the people there said that during lockdown, she had also gained weight. And she was like, actually, during lockdown, we gave our body the things it needed, the things it wanted. We gave ourselves comfort in that small way. So actually, why are we punishing ourselves for giving ourselves comfort during a time of great stress? Every time I'm starting to feel a little bit down, I think about that, and I'm like, oh no, actually it's amazing that I'm still here and still thriving somewhat. I also wanted to say I didn't start to hide myself. I started to hide other people when I was giving talks because I get very nervous. So if you can't see anybody, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how it's being received. You're just talking. No one can see it. You can only see you. It looks so professional. Amazing. Doesn't matter if everybody's frowning. So yeah, I started to do that because also I've been doing it this whole time, but I don't know how to stop. I just look at myself constantly. Like I look at everybody else and then I'm like, oh, me. The other thing I was going to say that's slightly related but slightly unrelated is I was growing out a pixie cut at the beginning of like lockdown. I don't know if anybody's ever done that, but when you're growing out very short hair, you get a mullet because of the way hair grows. And on some people that looks really, really cool. On me, it wasn't the one. It wasn't what I wanted. It was not what I asked for. So I hid it because you only ever see me in the front. What was the other thing? Oh, the labeling of self. Yeah, it's been really nice to be able to say, this is me, these are my pronouns, this is who I am, blah, 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 blah. And I've always been really bad for it. I forget people's names, like instantly. Like somebody will tell me their name, it's gone. I'm like, okay, great. If that never gets repeated, I won't know who you are unless I look it up afterwards and like memorize it. But it made it a lot easier for me with my like students and stuff, like so I could learn the names and and yeah, it was a lot easier. So it is nice to be able to label yourself. I wonder if some people who don't like to label themselves as like one specific thing really struggled with that, unless they just put their name. I don't know how that would work. Yeah, it's just a thought. But that is my big rambly response. I don't know if anybody has anything to say.
I do definitely agree with and like identify with a lot of what you've said, and definitely there's that sense of having to make peace with yourself because yourself is there, just unadulterated, like that is what's there. So, and that's what other people are going to consume, and that's definitely brought me some peace. Also, like this is a slightly more personal point, I suppose, about like what I've been up to in the last year, but my kind of career, I suppose, for want of a better sense, has really taken off in the last year. And a lot of the opportunities that have made that happen have been things like being invited to do a webinar on like a report that I wrote. And then that webinar turns into another, turns into another, turns into another. That turned into freelance work, and that freelance work turned into a permanent job. And all of that's happened over quite a short space of time. But I often think two things. One, how lucky I am that it all worked out well, and I definitely wouldn't, like last week I did a webinar at Cardiff Uni. Pre-pandemic, you know, you'd never be able to do these things because I would have had to take the whole day off work, which I couldn't really have done, you know, it would have just been a nightmare, whereas I can just like do these things online. So that's really opened up a lot of opportunities for me. It's allowed me to be almost in two places at once at the end of the day. But also I've reflected on the fact that, and I'm thinking because Hannah's saying that you hid everyone, I get that because I've done stuff, like I did one thing where I wasn't prepared for this at all, and then like 450 people came, and I was like, when I say I was prepared for the webinar, I wasn't prepared for the numbers, just to say, to retain my integrity. But you know, it was the Zoom webinar format, which is my favorite because there you can't see anyone. You and your panelists are just like hanging out together. And I think I kind of pride my presenting and communication skills is something that I'm always trying to improve, but it's something that I count as a skill and count as a strength. But I think it would have been sorely tested if I'd gone from not doing that huge amount to suddenly being asked to do webinars in front of 100, 200, 450 people. You know, people would have been able to see that I was really young and I wasn't used to doing that. Whereas I feel like on Zoom, I'm not nearly as nervous because I'm not in a room with hundreds of people in it. Like your whole body isn't there. So there's not room for your like body to betray signs of like physical awkwardness. You can have your notes. It's a dream. I do sometimes worry that I'll be exposed as a huge fraud when I have to then do something in person and then I seem really awkward. But the hope is that everyone will feel that way because everyone will have just got used to doing these things online.
Yeah, I completely agree, Mia, about this idea of feeling more comfortable without like seeing everyone. But also I think there's like something about just not being like a physical room with hundreds of people. And I really resonated when you were talking about like when people see that you're so young and feeling like, you know, getting the imposter syndrome. I am quite a short person. I am very young. And so I really worry that when I stand up and speak, I don't have that authority. I guess it starts to be a feedback loop when it plays into your anxieties, and then you really do start appearing nervous. I think what I kind of hope I've learned from this experience of like public speaking, and when I spoke a month or two ago, I did like the biggest talk I've ever done in my life, presenting my research at the National Gallery of Ireland. And it was just completely like, it was terrifying, but I was reassured by this Zoom format where I didn't have to see a bunch of people. And I was reassured because it was all about queer history. And I think I'm hoping, and I do believe that kind of feeling of comfort in that experience and after that experience will transfer to when I next speak in person, and I can feel more confident because of these brilliant experiences that I've had during lockdown.
I was going to say, yeah, you reminded me of like one other thing that I used to hate, like publicly speaking, is I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but when you can like hear yourself on the microphone, so you talk, there's a slight delay and you can hear yourself talking back, but you don't have that with Zoom. You don't have to hear the feedback. I was also going to say, say, as another note, I've been able to meet people. I know it's not meeting, but it is meeting. I've been able to meet people who I would just never come into contact with before. So there was somebody that I met at a conference who we had do an event recently, Miguel Zinter, who does like really amazing like performance art, but he's really amazing at linking that to theory, and especially like queer theory and conversations around race. And it's just, I've never seen anything as amazing as the work he does. I won't spoil it here, but the way it played out on the Zoom format, because you wouldn't have come across this before, but people were in the chat being like, I don't think this is real. What's going on? Blah, 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 blah. So they were chatting to each other, but you wouldn't have really had that in an audience because people tend to stay quiet. And just watching that was so much fun. I will also say I am fangirling a little bit here, which is like the nerdiest fangirling I'm about to do. But I was like in a room with Susan Stryker, and I know it's not the same, but it is the same, right? In a room with Susan Stryker, and we're about to be with the conference in a room with Jack Halberstam and Heather Love. I am the most excited and nervous I've ever been. And if either of them ever listen to this, no, you didn't. No, you didn't hear me fangirling. You just didn't. I'm so cool. I like do stuff like this all the time. It's great. It's like a room with them, right? It's like a proper like, oh my god, we're going to be in the room together. It's exciting. So I think Zoom's offered me that, I guess.
Queer proximity is like what's in my mind now from what you just said, and like the proximity we've been able to achieve to other queer people. We've talked a lot about that interpersonally, but we're also all nodding very excitedly about Halberstam and Heather Love, and like, you know, that idea of like proximity to people who've put our queerness into words and into concepts academically that we've clearly all identified with. It's just breaking another barrier down. And certainly the research that I did, the pandemic helped. I was very lucky in that the research trip I did to actually view my sources I did before the pandemic. So that's the caveat, is that I wasn't adversely affected in that way, which was very lucky. I basically wanted to speak to some more present day or recent history activists who'd picked up the story that I was writing about, because I wanted to show this like long arc of queer protest and like continuity in obviously kind of the history's meaning more than just being a history, you know, catalyzing modern day action. And when I did that, that was much easier and less awkward to organize because it was just a video call, which wasn't a weird thing to anyone by that stage. So I think everyone was also had a lot more time, was craving kind of a bit of a conversation. And like the other day, I did an interview with a like Harvard student reporter who is writing a piece on the secret court, which I wrote on, and present day queerphobia at Harvard. So kind of like a journalistic interpretation of a similar thing. And I thought nothing of just like hopping on Zoom with this reporter and talking to her, probably chewing her ear off for like an hour. And we were on different time zones and everything because it's just become so easy to do. Also, I hate the phone. And so not having to do it on the phone and being able to see a person fills me with joy.
It is so odd that I also hate the phone, but I'm willing to like sit here and do this. I don't know what the difference is. What was happening the other day? Somebody was calling me and I was like, yeah, I'm not picking that up. So we've spoke about this experience of lockdown, this queer perspective that is not quite tangible, right? You can't really capture it exactly in words. And then we spoke about Zoom, which is a lot more tangible, I think, because you can see it. You can, you know, we're recording it right now. You can do all of these things. And then we've also spoke about, you know, the boundaries of queer space and how we present and all of these things. But what I've been seeing recently is move to archive our experiences currently. You know, Queer Britain are doing an archive where they're having people send stuff in. We did our own one, Queering the Quarantine. I keep talking about it. I'm such a tease. I know it will be released. But that was much more trying to capture the intangible parts, right? It was about producing a creative piece based on queer experiences in quarantine, right? So we had songs, we had pictures, we had photographs, we had drawings, we had a GIF essay, which is really interesting and beautiful the way it was done. So we had all these different modes of communicating this kind of queer experience, right? Queer Britain, I don't know exactly how they're doing theirs. I think they're doing theirs with like interviews and letters and stuff like that. I want to say more traditionally historical without knowing exactly what's going on behind the scenes. I doubt it will be traditional being a queer archive. But how then do you think we capture this experience? Or can we? Or should we? Or all of these things?
I think that, I mean, the key thing is accessibility, of course, and ensuring that not just that more people have access to contribute to the archives, but more people have access to look through the archives and to see what's there. I think one of the things that's been quite interesting and good and bad in different ways is the importance, I think, or the rise of social media has become more central to modes of archiving over the last year. And I've seen that, I mean, you talked, Hannah, about like the Queer Britain. Over summer, they did a Queer Britain lockdown hunt that I kind of participated in, and that was all on social media. They had like a hashtag, and you could just go around your house and your spaces and take pictures of things that resonated queerly for you or that had a queer perspective, you had a queer perspective on, and share that. And I think it was really wonderful. And I found that, you know, by following lots of different queer archives, that I was able to find all these calls for submissions that I would have never have found other ways. It was really wonderful for me. I just wouldn't have had the personal connections to people at Queer Britain, I don't think, yet in my career to really like have heard about these things. And so that was really helpful. But at the same time, social media is often not accessible to certain groups such as, you know, queer elders. And I'm really interested in some of the work that some people have been doing, like with older queer people that they know, to try and help them submit to certain archives. So, I mean, for example, like the AIDS Memorial Instagram that's really popular, I've seen some submissions there that seem to have like been, I guess, facilitated by maybe a grandnephew of someone who's queer, and then they help them to do that. But I think there are some other ways that we could be pushing to make it more accessible. I think oral histories would be central to that, and making it more accessible to elders. And I think it feels wonderful that there's been a massive drive for like collective sourcing in the archive from queer institutions over the last year. But I do really want to push for more accessibility, especially for queer elders, to archive these histories before they are lost.
Yeah, huge respect for that perspective. And I'm really glad that that's what was said first, because I think that's like super vital and important. And actually what we've kind of been saying this whole time, right, is that the queer archive is not just a random room full of dusty boxes in the corner of some university town somewhere. Like, it has the power to speak to our identities and like to make us feel we belong. And so with that power and like that potential comes a responsibility to make that available to as many queer people as possible. The other thing I was going to add in terms of Hannah's original question about like how we do this and how I think it's going to be done, and like how to ensure that the queerness is preserved. I suppose mine may be slightly kind of naive, but we'll say it because it's kind of sweet. Despite everything that is thrown at queer existence, a bit like we were saying earlier, it finds a way. And so in terms of preserving the queerness precisely of the queer things we want to archive from this time, I have faith that like the queer people of the future will be able to locate our queerness in what we archive, because we've located our ancestors' queerness in what they archived. Like, what gave me such a strong sense of queerness that I abandoned my previous project idea and wrote an entire master's thesis on The Secret Court was the contents of 2 letters. That's all, 2 letters. I mean, both of them were a bit long, but also, like, you know, they contained so much stuff. They were filled with gossip, and a lot of that, I mean, you had to decode it quite a lot. For example, they talk about in one letter how this guy had gone out with his friend Dorothy the night before, and then Dorothy had bought a wig from this shop and it had cost this much, and they were going to a party in a couple days and it would be perfect for it. Now, someone who's slightly more clueless might read that and be like, okay. Whereas, of course, based on lots of other, obviously, checking and cross-referencing, like, I know that Dorothy is a code name for another male friend, and they were shopping for drag to then go to a drag ball in a yacht club, which is even funnier. But anyway, so like, we're in a position where we are able to leave kind of explicit queer archival material because we're able to say that it's explicitly queer now, at least in this country. But also, I'm not hugely worried because I feel like part of the joy of this is that whether it's labelled queer or not, the queer people will find it and think, aha, I understand what was going on here, you know? So I'm quite optimistic about the potential for like bottling this like quarantine queerness because I feel like people will be able to identify it.
I love that bottling the quarantine queerness. That's so exciting. I get really excited about the idea of future queer histories, like what will be queer history in the future. And I always think, yeah, they will find it, but it does make me laugh that some things are going to require such cultural knowledge to like, again, decode it, right? It's just going to be like, here's this random meme that I found on the internet. And why is this specifically queer? And if we looked at it now, we'd be like, well, obviously that makes just so much sense. But 100, 200, 300 years from now, they're going to look at that and be like, what? I always think about the TikTok jokes and just stuff like that. Like, if it ever does get saved, what will happen with that? And yeah, so the Queer in the Quarantine has gone into the Modern Record Centre and it's being digitally archived. I'm not doing any of this, by the way. The digital archivists are doing that, but they showed me some of the like, we need it in this file format because if it's in this one it doesn't work and blah blah blah. It needs to be saved in such a specific way to be found in the future. It's really interesting to see what will get saved and what people will be able to find and what people will do with it. The other archival project that I just wanted to point out that I remembered, and I don't know why it slipped my mind. So the Museum of Transology is currently collecting, I don't think they ever really stopped collecting, but they more specifically started collecting around Black trans lives matter. And so they're starting to build up more of a collection specifically there. Some of my research was on the Museum of Transology, which is why it's shameful that I forgot that they were still collecting. But when I was at Trans Pride and I was helping out and I was getting participants for my research and stuff, because I was with the Museum of Transology, and when I was talking through the Museum of Transology with some people, they were like, oh, I could fill a room with all the things that could represent me and my identity. Again, still, whose stories get saved, whose stories will get saved, what in the collection of the stuff behind us in a Zoom room will get saved, right? Like, will people in the future be looking and be like, in Mia's room there's books, and what is the name of that book, and let me find it, and what kind of person was Mia? So interesting. I was going to ask what your fave story from any archive has been. Yeah, the thing that really captured your interest the most. And I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but my favorite source, I think it will forever be my favorite source. I've not found another one that captured my interest in the same way. In 18th century England, so in 1732, there is a transcript of a trial. Both of you have probably heard of this because it's a popular one if you know queer history. But yeah, in 1732 there was a trial in which a person called John Cooper prosecuted Tom Gordon for stealing his clothes. And Tom Gordon turns it around and essentially just calls John Cooper a sodomite, all these various different things. There's then character witnesses. I don't remember exactly why, but there's character witnesses that come forward for John Cooper. And the first character witness comes forward, and it's a woman in this courtroom, and she says, oh, you know, the Princess Seraphina. And everybody goes, what? No, hang on, what are you talking about? And she goes, oh, well, I've never known him by any other name. And then all these women come forward and start saying that John Cooper is actually known as Princess Seraphina, you know, goes to balls in very beautiful, fancy dresses, dates men, is a nurse, all these kinds of things. And we only have this one source and another source that says that Princess Seraphina was present for somebody's wedding. And I just really love it because it shows, like, in this brief flash, this whole network of queerness in the background, right? All these women who knew about John Cooper, who knew about Princess Seraphina, right? Who clearly didn't care, right? Actively liked Princess Seraphina. You know, there's people that are like, Princess Seraphina comes around and looks after my dad, and Princess Seraphina comes around and like borrows dresses from me and all kinds of stuff, right? I think that's partly why it's said so openly in this courtroom, right? Because these women are like, Princess Seraphina, like, what? And then it also shows just this kind of gender fluidity identity in the past. You know, because what do you ever call this? I ran a whole session about Molly houses back in the day. I think it was like 2018. And I was like, if you labeled this history with a modern term, which people say not to do, right? But if you're going to label it to make it identifiable to the public, what the hell do you label this? Because John Cooper is also, in the other source, it says John Cooper is a butcher. So then John Cooper's living his whole life as a butcher, but then on the evening, you know, he's Princess Seraphina, and Bricta Norton, who's the main historian, calls Seraphina like England's first recognizable drag queen, something like that. And I'm like, okay, but it feels like more to me. It feels like more. It feels like I'm living my whole life as much as I can in this other identity. And apologies if I've flipped around with pronouns, because I truly have no idea. Like, I don't know. This was the first one that I ever read that I was like, this is it. And then there's also some other stuff from Molly Houses where there's like, Richard Norton calls it, he calls it like fake births. And I hesitate to call it fake because is it fake, right? But these men who sit and replicate birth with like dolls and stones and all this kind of stuff, and I just think, like, what is that? Like, what is that? You know, when we're talking about decoding the past, okay. If you can decode that, I will be very impressed. You will have many awards from me. I think there are people trying to, like, I remember Kit Hyam spoke a little bit about this, EJ Scott spoke a little bit about this. So yeah, I'm fascinated to see where this history goes. But yeah, I've talked for too long. Anybody else have any interesting archival stories?
I think the one that I want to tell, I mean, it's from my thesis again, and there were so many revelations. I'll quickly explain the very bare bones of the context, and then I'll give the specific thing that I was very excited to realize. So essentially what my thesis is about is a period of time in 1920 at Harvard University in the US, where administrators and kind of disciplinarians at the uni became aware of a group of queer men, essentially, I mean, as far as I know, with their identities anyway, who were studying at the university and were kind of part of a community and were very like loud and proud and doing their thing and having a great time. And they became aware of this because one of the group had just committed suicide, which it seems very much to do with the way that he was treated by the university when he fell behind on his work. But of course, the finger was immediately pointed to the people that he was hanging out with, and et cetera, et cetera. And the archive, like the sources that we have, are the records that detail the subsequent prosecution of these men by the university. But one of the things they did is seize letters between the men that were written before this whole thing happened, specifically letters that were tragically written to the man who committed suicide and arrived on the doormat after he'd already died. So he never read them, but the friends didn't know because obviously the letters took a couple of days to reach him. So unfortunately, the letters that I say are so amazing and I loved reading them and they're so joyful, they were never actually read by who was meant to read them, which is really sad. But originally, when this story was uncovered, it was uncovered by Harvard student journalists in the early 2000s. But despite a big fight with the university's administration, they were never permitted to look at the files in full. They were only given very heavily redacted versions of it, despite the fact that it happened like 80 years ago. Like, what? And when I did it, I was able to view the original files. And I think the first or one of the first people or any people to be able to do that. There was so much lost with redaction because even though there was a coded system, you know, S1, P1, whatever, for certain people who came up a lot, and the journalists had been able to uncover those real people at the time, there were a lot of people who were only mentioned a couple of times who weren't coded. So much of the subtlety of their broader community was lost. And there's loads of things I could talk about, but the thing that really kind of struck me, I was thinking when I was doing this research that obviously I found this really important, but I was aware that it was the story of what seemed to be some exclusively white upper middle class men at an elite university who were, for all intents and purposes, for what we can tell anyway, white, cis, gay men. But what I actually discovered was that they were the focus because they were at an all-male university, but they were part of quite an intersectional community in Boston that was much larger than just them, and that seems to have included people who, at least from what we can tell, right, were not cis or playing with gender, and also gay women seem to have been in this circle and were invited to parties and stuff like that. And specifically, one of the ringleaders of this group had a fiance. She was called Helen, and a lot of the previous, well, all the previous work on this had just assumed that Helen was like long suffering or a beard of some kind or whatever, and that presumably she kind of didn't know anything. And what I was able to find through reading an original letter, not a redacted one, is that this guy talks about, he says, Thursday afternoon, I am going out to Brookline, which is an area of Boston, and Helene, with an E, my cousin's wife, and Helen are going to fix me up in my drag and take pictures. More darn fun. So what happened was, because of shoddy redacting, Helene, who's clearly a different person than the fiancée Helen, was kind of conflated. So no one had uncovered or realised that in this line is revealed the fact that Helen, the fiancée, is fully on board with the whole thing, because Helene, and Ernest Roberts are all going to dress Roberts in drag and take pictures and like have more darn fun on a Thursday evening in a suburb. And seeing that just transformed the way that I viewed this, especially because Roberts wrote in another letter, writing to someone, you know how she is the kind of girl I can say anything to at all. Now, if you don't know the proper context, everyone will be like, oh, how cute, you know, they were in love. Or you think that's really sad because obviously he couldn't say, you know. But actually, my interpretation that I'm going to take from it anyway is that no, he could say anything to her at all. And maybe Helen was queer herself. We don't know. But whatever we do know, like that to me is like some wonderful queer friendship and like queer community in the archive, that clearly they had a very close relationship and clearly she accepted and celebrated his queerness and what he was doing. We can't know the full story, but when I realized that, I think I was in a library, I was like, yes, but obviously I couldn't really say anything because I was in a library, but it was the moment.
That sounds so incredible. I really, really love that. And I especially am interested in this idea of uncovering things that have been previously obfuscated, you know, swept under the carpet in the archives. Leading on from that, and also, I'm afraid, talking about another pair of white cis gay men, actually not necessarily gay. I'm talking about Michelangelo now. I think Michelangelo personally, in anachronistic modern terms, is more kind of bi. I think he was a very sexually fluid person. He spent most of his life celibate, but appears to have, but then engaged with a several decades long relationship with this young Roman nobleman, Tommaso di Cavalieri. And then within that sort of 30-year span, there was about 10 years when Michelangelo also spent some time with this noble woman called Vittoria Colonna. And in the archives, Michelangelo's nephew, who was also confusingly called Michelangelo Buonarroti, redacted a lot of the, well, actually changed, went into the Buonarroti archives and changed the pronouns and some of the, you know, verb endings in the original Italian to make it seem as if some of the letters and love poems that Michelangelo had sent to Tommaso were written to a woman, presumably for Vittoria. And I've found it fascinating going back and seeing the changed versions and then kind of, I guess, seeing their relationship with fresh eyes in this way, because it's taken, you know, so long for those things to be corrected. I'm pretty sure it was actually my ancestor, the queer activist John Addington Symonds, who translated the original sonnet with the proper pronouns in English in 1893. And one passage that I love and that I think kind of resonates with this idea of homophobia, I guess, hushing the brilliance of this queer love, is this poem here that Michelangelo wrote to Tommaso in 1532. So I'm just going to read two little snippets from it. It starts, if one chaste love, if one God-given piety, if one same fortune by two lovers dared, if one the grief but two the pain it shared, if one will rules two hearts whose souls agree, bodies doubled, set one spirit free, and both to heaven rise on quick wings paired. And then I'm cutting to the end now. If this were true 1,000-fold, its wealth would be 100th of the love I claim is ours, and here's the important bit, which disdain only could bring low. And I think that it was Michelangelo's nephew's disdain for their queer brilliance that brought low, that hushed their love, that has eventually brought out. I think that's beautiful. Another thing I quickly like to bring in is some recent research that I've done. I've just handed in actually last week my second year final project, extended essay thingy. And it was all about the Zishunu, who are a group of women in the southern Guangdong region of China who existed from at least sort of the early 19th century until the late 20th century, and there are a couple still alive today, but this practice is dying out. And they were a group of women who ritually established themselves as permanently unmarried, often lived together in collective residences, such as one which I've studied in depth called Bingyutang. And within that Bingyutang place, within this residence, I recently found a series of oral histories that were conducted in 2006 and 2007 of women of Zishunu in that residence. And unfortunately, they talked with a lot of shame about these things, but they did mention that there were a few queer couples in that group, and that was actually something that was kind of expected. That was quite a common thing, and that unfortunately the way that they were posing that in the oral histories was quite upsetting, with some things like saying that there were very, very few, and there was a upsetting phrase about don't let one rat dropping spoil the soup. But I think finding this kind of complex and nuanced example of queerness in very recent history from China, which has had such persecution for years and years and still has persecution against representation of queerness. Like, for example, in 2018, they released a restriction on filmic representations of anything queer, grouping in queerness with incest and sexual assault as sexual abnormalities, as they called it, that couldn't be presented. I just think these examples of queerness still existing and still being acknowledged despite any shame that's felt is really powerful. Yeah.
Thank you very much, both. It's stories like these, also this passion that you both spoke with, right? That really remind me of why we need representation, why we need history, why we need to remember these moments and these stories. And, we've kind of moved talking about our own experiences of queerness, but also this, to have ourselves represented in a way that we would be happy with, right? But I just wanted to give you both the chance to plug any social media or any projects that you're doing or anything that you have recently done, and then we will have to say goodbye.
This has been such a great conversation. I have really loved talking about everything. So thank you to you both. You can find me on the internet basically by just Googling my name, because no one else seems to have it, which is useful. If you're interested in queer things that I've done, we can link in the show notes a blog that I wrote relatively recently about a report into LGBT histories and historians. So I wrote a bit of a kind of personal reflection on what that report says that might interest listeners. Otherwise, the majority of my work right now is in decolonizing and anti-racism. So if you're interested in that stuff too, then we can link some of the pieces and reports that I've written in the show notes. But yeah, just to say that I've absolutely loved this, and it feels very kind of fitting that we've talked a lot about carving out queer space, but we've literally done that through having this conversation for ourselves as well. So no better way to spend a Sunday morning.
I completely agree. What a fun time we've had. I've just felt so much warp through the screens talking to you, and it's been really wonderful to, as we've said, talk about our personal experiences, but how that resonates with queer histories and, what future generations might see as our current queer histories. I just think it's beautiful. So thank you. Thank you so much for having me. You can Google me as well, because I have quite a unique name apparently as well. Or you can find me on Twitter at Queering Culture, or also I'd love to promote the society that I run at my university, the Courtauld Institute of Art. I run the LGBTQI+ society there, and you can find us on Instagram at LGBTQ Courtauld. And also, just lastly, if anyone's listening who would like to see some of the Michelangelo work that I've done, my thesis on that, or my thesis on the Zishunu, which I've just finished, I'm interested in finding some places to publish either of them, because I'm yet to have shared those. So please do get in touch.
So thank you both for being here. It's been really, really amazing, really interesting. I'm excited to get this episode out, and for everybody to hear it. If you're interested in following me, seeing what I do, at Miss_HBA on Twitter, that is me. You'll see it in the little description of the podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts. And all the work we do on Queer Disrupt, at Queer Disrupt anywhere, or Queer/Disrupt everywhere, because some of the social media sites do not allow for our beautiful slash. But I wanted to thank you both thank you again for joining me. It's been really, really fun. Thank you very much. I'm going to say bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Queer Disrupt podcast. Do you want to hear more? Well, check out our Podbean where we host all of our podcasts, but you should be able to find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you normally find your podcasts. But please let us know if we're not where you usually get yours. And rate and subscribe to us. It really helps us, genuinely. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. So follow us there to stay up to date on all of our events and catch up on when we release our tickets for upcoming events. All of our events have limited numbers, so make sure you subscribe to be the first in for a chance. Our website is queerdisrupt.com, so check us out there. And finally, all of the work is produced by us for free, but making these events and podcasts are expensive. We rely on the generosity of you, our amazing audience, to keep us going and producing everything we do for free. Pop onto queerdisrupt.com and click on the donate button. Every penny you give goes straight back into producing more content for you to listen and watch to for free. Thank you and catch you next time.